Okay, so I'll hand it over now to Jonathan to.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that kind introduction. And thanks, Kirsty, for having us here to talk to you today. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my slides. Can everyone see those okay? Yeah, great. Yeah, great. So I'm here to talk about a book that I've just it's just going to come out in January with Emily, who's also here today. So please jump in, Emily, at any point if you think I've missed anything or would like to add anything to what I'm going to talk about today. And also, we've written this with Jake Watts as well. And the book's called The Politics of Feeling in Brexit Britain, Stories from the Mass Observation Archive. And, sorry, is it on presentation mode? Yeah. I guess the starting point for this book was that we wanted to kind of interrogate this kind of popular narrative that Brexit represented this newly formed of emotional politics in Britain, where kind of voters were increasingly kind of following feelings instead of fact and reason. You know, and I think you can see this in the kind of the way that the media and press kind of covered the referendum campaign back in 2016, the way it was kind of framed as a kind of this conflict between head and heart. And I think in the aftermath as well, there was this sense that the outcome, that the vote to leave the European Union was kind of interpreted as being this kind of triumph of kind of passion over rationality. And again, in the aftermath of the referendum, there was a lot of kind of concern about the kind of feelings that had been generated by the referendum itself, both for people who voted to leave and also for people who voted to remain. And there was this kind of concern that Britain's political culture is becoming increasingly polarized. There was concern that this kind of question about EU membership had kind of torn through personal relationships, and it provoked these kind of strong emotional encounters between strangers. And I guess it kind of gets us to this point where we're kind of the sense where Brexit is seen as both kind of representing this kind of unusually emotional movement within our kind of within national life. And it's also seen as kind of producing these kind of excessive emotions within our political culture as well. And we kind of see this in common narratives that are then kind of set within a broader political and cultural frame, where I think we can see this in some kind of popular books, that kind of Age of Anger, or this idea that we're living in a time when feelings have taken over the world. And often what's kind of meant by this is there's this sense that these kind of particularly negative emotions of kind of fear, anger, are seen as being damaging, I guess, for democracy. They're kind of associated with voting for populist parties. They're associated with people holding kind of these nativist attitudes. They're associated with intolerance, and this idea that there's kind of less collaboration among citizens as well. And I suppose as historians working in our politics department, like the thing that really stood out to us is how these claims seemed really quite ahistorical. The idea that we were living in a period where emotions mattered more than they may have done in the past. And they also seem to disregard a significant body of academic literature within social science and political sciences that has shown that, you know, emotions, feelings, they are an unavoidable and indeed essential aspect of how people form political judgments. And I think even just looking at the kind of political science literature, you know, there's already, you know, a range of studies that kind of highlighted, you know, the role of emotions in shaping individual attitudes and voting habits around in European parliament elections and attitudes towards the European Union itself. And I think, again, for us, when we looked at this literature, what kind of struck us was how this seemed kind of out of sync with kind of approaches from historians, in the sense that emotions are kind of treated as being these kind of fixed individual responses that can be kind of quantified and measured alongside other variables in trying to analyze how they impact upon political behavior and political attitudes. You know, this sense that angry voters might be more predisposed to vote a certain way, or anxious voters might be more inclined to behave in a certain way, you know, engage in kind of information seeking behavior and things like that. And it really struck us that not only were a lot of these kind of claims within the kind of more general literature ahistorical, and these kind of claims within the kind of political science literature kind of treating emotion as these kind of fixed individual responses. We also felt there was a real kind of lack of citizens' voices within these debates as well. So, you know, we were really interested in trying to think a little bit more about, you know, how did people, voters themselves, understand this kind of situation within the context of the EU referendum? You know, how did they interpret their own decision making? You know, did they understand that as being emotional? Did they feel that they were prioritizing emotions when they were voting? Was there a difference between Remain and Leave voters and how they kind of thought about this? How did people judge the feelings of other people, of other voters? How did they experience the broader kind of emotional mood of the referendum itself, and its kind of aftermath? And then finally, how did they kind of navigate all of this within their everyday lives? So to answer these questions, we decided to turn to the mass observation project, which we sort of thought represented like an ideal source of you know, rich resource of evidence of how people kind of recorded their feelings around the EU referendum. And you can see this, there were 3 directives carried out in 2016, so kind of which covered like kind of the period before and during the referendum itself. Then another one in 2017, a year after the referendum, and then finally one on 2019, the day when Britain was supposed to leave the EU. And I think what's interesting from this, well, we found there's about, I think roughly, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's around 550 responses to these directives. And I think what's really interesting is how they were kind of framed within kind of emotional terms themselves, kind of in line with kind of established practice within mass observation. We see how kind of the directives focus on questions around hopes, fears. I think feelings are mentioned kind of 6 times across the 3 directives. So it's kind of understandable in some ways that mass observers are going to write about their feelings in relation to this, in relation to these prompts. And I think what we really want to do is try and read these kind of responses to these directives and really try and think about the position of feelings in the stories that people told about Brexit and their experiences of the EU referendum and its aftermath. So from this, I guess what we found, we kind of chose to sort of divide the book itself into these kind of 2 parts, where we on the one hand see this kind of popular narrative about heads and hearts, this idea that feelings were this kind of personal feelings were kind of intruding into political life, if you like. And we looked at how people understood the role of feelings within their kind of specific voting decisions, and also how they thought about the feelings of other peoples and how this kind of contributed to the way they judged other people and the kind of stereotypes that emerged in the aftermath of the referendum about Leave and Remain voters, and how that kind of shaped these kind of growing political divisions within the country. And then in the second part of the book, we kind of turn around to look at these kind of stories of excessive emotions themselves, and the idea of kind of how political feelings kind of intrude into personal life. And in particular, look at individuals' kind of perceptions of the wider public moods that emerged in Brexit, in response to Brexit, and how they kind of use those kind of public moods to kind of interpret their own individual experiences and feelings. And And then finally, we look at how that kind of intruded into their own intimate kind of personal relationships and how they kind of navigated that. And it's that kind of final part, that final chapter, final thing we like to focus on, personal relationships, that I'm going to kind of spend the rest of today's presentation talking about. So I think one of the kind of dominant narratives about the kind of emotional politics of Brexit was this idea that it intruded into personal relationships, that it produced tension, produced arguments, it even, led to relationship breakdowns at times. You can see this kind of in the headlines that are kind of reported there on the slide. Even on a kind of more general level, you can think about how this, in this period between 2017 to 2019, every Christmas come around and you would see these kind of stories that would emerge that would be providing advice for how to negotiate the issue of Brexit around the kind of Christmas dinner table, how to kind of talk about this in a way that won't lead to kind of ruining Christmas, I guess, how to kind of negotiate these kind of differences and points of disagreement. And again, although I think when, in terms of like an opinion poll, you can see there that only kind of 13% of people said they believe Brexit would, in fact, lead to tension around the Christmas dinner table. There's still that sense within kind of popular culture that Brexit was ultimately kind of exceeding the realm of the political, and that it had become this kind of matter for intimate exchange, okay, as much as it was a kind of political issue, a source of political debate. And you can see that, the BBC produced this kind of Crossing the Brexit Divide resource that was kind of there to provide advice for people to how to kind of negotiate and discuss these differences, these points of difference in a kind of healthy way. And we think about, there were special episodes of things like TV programs like Gogglebox, Wife Swap, and many other examples. There was a BBC listening project as well that were all kind of about negotiating these points of difference. And I think in the, there was a sense that Brexit, I guess, emotional expression and exchange around Brexit was seen as being kind of healthy and necessary, but also kind of dangerous and something that required kind of careful treatment. And often I think this was kind of reflected this idea that this kind of wider idea that political disagreement heals through kind of intimate exchange, if you like, through kind of empathy, understanding, through kind of talk that kind of this idea that it's good to talk. That was kind of first, I think, promoted in the British Telecom advert back in the early 90s, or late 1980s. And I think, what we really found looking at the mass observation material in terms of how this played out in everyday life was that most people really were quite ambivalent, I think, it would be fair to say, towards that idea. You see people generally, here, this observer here is talking about how I have relatives who voted leave. We don't talk politics. We never did, but even more, we don't talk politics today. The one thing this other individual here identifies is that after the EU referendum, it's that people are even less likely to talk about politics than they did before. No one introduces this as a topic in everyday life. They don't want to get into a possibly acrimonious debate. So there's this sense that rather than it being good to talk, that actually there's this fear that if people do talk about this stuff, it's going to produce these points of tension, these points of conflict that people would really ideally like to avoid. And we can see, that's not the case necessarily for everyone. I think you see this kind of one, for some, there's a sense of there being this kind of moral duty to try and I guess kind of confront people who hold different opinions to themselves. And you can see here this response from this engineering director from Cambridge. He talks about how I was not surprised that my father for example, voted to leave, but that he would try and defend his position uninvited whilst in my home caught me off guard. Rarely have my parents and I discussed politics. However, the referendum did generate discussion. Rarely does a child express shame, as I did to my father when he suggested he voted leave. We now stick to sports and his grandchildren as safer topics now. So again, there's this kind of sense that people are having to kind of avoid politics as a way of trying to preserve their relationships. Okay. And I think what's kind of underpinning a lot of this is it's not just people kind of afraid of kind of preserving their own relationships or fear of being judged or misinterpreted, but also this sense that people have to, that this respondent here talks about having to kind of, I have to watch myself, that I don't say anything that would upset my aunt and uncle. So I just smile and nod and say I'm bored of the whole thing. There's this fear of saying the wrong thing and that her aunt and uncle might hate her, hate all of us for this. So again, it's this sort of sense, not just of having to like kind of, I guess, ultimately kind of suppress feelings. It's not just about a fear of being kind of judged oneself as an individual, but it's also, there's this fear about the feelings that this might invoke in others, I guess. This sense that this individual might hate her, you know, because of her views about the EU. And again, you can kind of see, this was like a kind of common story that we saw throughout the directives, that where there's this sense that people have a kind of duty to try and kind of suppress their feelings for fear of of upsetting other people. Sense that this could lead to kind of impending violence in this kind of rather extreme case. For the final respondent there, who talks about having to watch what I say in public gatherings. The atmosphere is oppressive and one has a feeling of this impending violence. So there's this kind of, again, I think we need to be kind of wary of making some of these kind of broad generalizations, and we need to think a bit about how mass observation allows to see how it is obviously sometimes more complex than this, and it's also kind of contextual as well. And you see this here from this individual who talks about, you know, when I'm with my friends, I suspect I might feel that Brexit is the right way forward. I don't mention the subject. I would be in danger of upsetting them with my strong opinions. So again, it's that common story that we're seeing a lot of people talking about, you know, suppressing their views for fear of invoking negative emotions in others. But then when talking about the same individual, when talking about how they talk about politics with their own parents, they now feel kind of emboldened to remind them constantly that the mess in this country is their fault. They have condemned their grandchildren and great-grandchildren to uncertainty and probably penury. They actually said, well, then they'll know what it was like for us in the 1930s. I couldn't believe my ears to have been through such hardship and then want to visit that upon innocent future generations is beyond my understanding. Okay, so I think that in itself illustrates again how, you know, there's these kind of different kind of feeling rules that are emerging in the aftermath of Brexit to some extent, where people have been provoked to think about their personal relationships in ways that perhaps they hadn't done before. And they have to think about how they kind of manage those relationships in the future. And you can see here from this respondent who talks about a close friend of mine voted to leave, and I worry about my attitudes towards her. Should I distance myself from her? I've thought a lot about this, and I think that I will politely say that I don't want to discuss politics with her. Should she express unpleasant, unacceptable views about immigrants, I will have to say that I don't want to listen to such comments. And again, we see a sort of similar idea of this person having to block or unfriend his brother and other friends who voted differently as a result. And they become aware of this because of the referendum itself. And so I think that's my been talking for 20 minutes to kind of wrap up. I think what sort of tried to illustrate is how, you know, mass observation provides this kind of wonderful insight into how much more complicated these stories of kind of political divisions are in everyday life than the more kind of simplistic narratives about polarization within Britain's political culture that often seem to kind of take leave and remain as kind of fixed badges that determine individuals' identities and how they kind of interact with other people. And I think what you see in the mass observation material is how, you know, people find talking about Brexit very difficult and awkward, but they often do find ways to kind of really try and preserve their relationships and find ways of kind of muddling through. And I think there's a kind of irony in there somewhere, in the sense that for many people, you know, the whole referendum was kind of framed as being this kind of opportunity to begin a kind of national political discussion. And often, you know, it had the opposite effect, you know, in the sense that it led many people to actually kind of avoid talking about politics completely. And I think that has all kinds of interesting implications for debates about kind of deliberative democracy and things like that we can maybe talk about in the questions. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now. So yeah, thank you for listening.